In today's video, I'm going to talk about some of the most asked questions at Apple during their job interviews. And basically, I compiled a list with the 36 most commonly asked questions, which I'll better group into 9 categories that I'm going to talk about today. And just quickly before we begin, 15% of any question asked in an Apple interview, including the technical ones, contains the word customer. So if there's one takeaway, this will be for the whole thing. Also, there are almost 100 occurrences of the keyword strength here, which would be, of course, an indicator of the fact that you should actually focus on your strengths in a job interview. So, without further ado, let's see what we have here. And the first group of questions that I would like to talk about is the ones linked with decision making. So questions related to decision making might be: tell me about the toughest decision you had to make in the past 6 months, or tell me about the time you had to deal with ambiguity, or a time when you faced a problem that had multiple solutions, or describe a difficult decision you've had to make in your business life and how you went about doing it, or simply tell me about the time when you took the lead on a difficult project. You see, so it doesn't mean that if I put these questions in a decision-making context that this is a strict science. For example, the last question, tell me about the time when you took a lead on a difficult project, could also easily be about your interpersonal skills, but I put them here because I found this would be the more relevant context in our case. And by the way, no need to write down this information. I included these questions in the video description. So maybe also interesting to talk about here is what's a good answer and what's a bad answer when it comes to decision making in general. Maybe if we take the first example, tell me about the toughest decision you have to make in the past 6 months, would be a more concise way to talk about these things. So a good answer would be an answer where you give a genuine example of something you really done in the past 6 months ideally in a team context if possible, because you see, these corporations are teams of people, so whenever you give an example, you should consider taking one out of a team experience. Also, you should be very much aware that no matter how smart you are, some of the toughest decisions are a team effort. So asking for help is actually something that would score you points if you choose to mention it while answering such questions. So basically, what's the second question, the second example, how to deal with ambiguity, is also a very relevant way, a very relevant approach to measure the effectiveness of an answer when it comes to decision making. So, are you good at dealing with ambiguity? What are the steps you took to address that specific situation? So, of course, unless you live under a rock, you'd know about the STAR method to answer these types of behavioral questions. So while answering the questions related to decision making, the bulk of the most important part of your STAR answer is actually the action part of it. And of course, from taking this answer from good, that is a great decision-making process, to a great answer, you would also have to quantify in order to provide some quantifiable results that resulted from your action. So this is how you would answer questions related with decision making. Also, maybe one last note here: recent examples are always preferred, and actually this actually becomes obvious from the first question, in the past 6 months. So always keep in mind that recent examples are better. The 8th category here is about curiosity. So actually, everyone starts somewhere. Tell me about the time when you were new on the job and had a lot to learn. How did you manage that? So when talking about curiosity, they are interested in your ability to learn. Are you someone that's a quick learner? Because you see, it's impossible whenever you get into a new role, especially at a company such as Apple, to be able to know everything in advance. So in order to succeed in such an environment, you must be a quick learner and someone that's genuinely curious by definition. How do you show these things? Well, you could actually basically use the keyword curiosity. I'm a curious person, I'm a quick learner, and all these things in your answer. But further than this, you should emphasize the fact that you see this as a journey instead of a destination. So you are the type of person who is connected to the news, who regularly follows the news for any new events and for the latest technologies and so on and so forth. Basically, this is it's one of the easier questions, right? Because why would you apply for a job at such an innovative company unless you are genuinely interested in these things? The seventh category of questions here are related with success. Basically, these are gifts that the interviewer offer you to basically focus on your strengths. And there are 4 examples here. Tell me about a team project you worked on. Remember the keyword team. Tell me about the time you exceeded your expectations. Give me an example of a time when you set a goal and were able to meet or achieve it. And describe a long-term project that you managed. How did you keep everything moving along in a timely manner? So again, these are gifts. Whenever you're being offered such a question, that's your ability to shine. That's when you have this unique opportunity, and what better way to capitalize on this than to prepare it in advance, of course. How would you prepare the most successful project you've ever done? Well, that's pretty much up to you, but what I can tell you, and from my coaching business, it's that I usually recommend you to prepare these main highlights of your career while preparing an answer for tell me about yourself. When answering tell me about yourself, basically you should give a quick overview over what you've done with some of the main highlights in your career, 2 of them, 1, 2, maybe even 3 if you have a lot of experience. So this is how you would go on success. And of course, needless to say, focus on your strengths. The 6th category of questions that are asked quite a lot in Apple interviews are related with deadlines in general. Tell me about the time when you were not able to meet a time commitment. What prevented you from meeting it? What was the outcome, and what did you learn from it? Or another variation of it, do you feel like you work well under pressure? If so, describe a time when you've done so, actually, when you delivered on under pressure. And these questions about meeting deadlines are, of course, on one hand, the interviewer wants to see. So let's take the first question. When you were not able to meet the time commitment, this is a failure story, actually, right? The first thing someone would be interested when asking you this question is whether you have a genuine failure. And believe it or not, most people don't have genuine failures, or have failures that they sugarcoat, or there are failures that are not quantifiable or are not real failures, or they give a general hypothetical story just because they don't like failure, which is, a natural sentiment. So this is the first thing why number 1 mistake that people make when talking about failure stories. Now, what's a great answer here? A great answer would be one that talks 1 or 2 sentences about the situation, 2 or 3 sentences about that specific time and how you failed to achieve the deadline, and 3 sentences on the learnings from this. So the bulk of your answer should be focused on your learnings. And actually, the question is phrased in such a way: what was the outcome and what did you learn from it? So it's self-explanatory, but more often than not, you won't get this lucky into a job interview. They won't read the full thing. The second one, do you feel you work well under pressure? So you must think of a situation where you delivered under pressure, and again, it must be a star answer. So ideally, it should be a team example of time you worked in a team, again, as always. And I believe you also have the opportunity here to score some points on interpersonal skills if you, for example, use your communication ability to prevent any delays in a project and to use this to your advantage. Maybe a member of your team got sick and you had to hire someone else, and you've done so quickly. So again, your ability to hire people. So these are all, there can be all kinds of scenarios where delivering something on a tight deadline was pretty difficult, and basically I would definitely recommend you to prepare this in advance. It must be really something special that would highlight on your ability to deliver under pressure, and basically you should find an example that highlights on the pressure part of this whole thing. All right, number 5 is actually a pretty common question asked during job interviews. What's your strength and what's your weakness? Needless to say, in the beginning of the video I said that the word strength appears quite often, around 100 times in questions and according to my research there. But this is because what happens often is that people tend to believe, especially outside the US, that tend to believe that talking about your strengths is self-advertising yourself. And it would be said here, in some culture it does sound like this. But even so, I do believe that it's a great strategy to think about what are your 1, 2, 3 main strengths, and not only that, but to focus on some stories that would highlight these strengths or differentiators. In other words, if your strength is, for example, your ability to deliver under tight deadlines, then you should think of a time where it was impossible to deliver under a tight deadline, but you did it anyway. This is how you should look at these things. Now, the weakness part is probably the less intuitive of these. And for the weakness, many people feel like they don't have a proper weakness, and they actually turn a positive into a negative. They say, for example, that my main weakness is paying too much attention to details, which is actually a strength, because why on earth would you apply for companies such as Apple when you don't have it, when you have attention to detail? I mean, it makes no sense. You cannot have attention to detail. You have too much attention to detail. It's or another one that I find suspicious is I have a very bad work-life balance. I think, you see, it could be a weakness. I'm not saying it's not. But when applying at such a company, you are competing against 100 other people, or just 50, all right? The interviewer's job is, between others, to see, hey, is this person someone whom I enjoy working with? Or if you put it in such a way that I'm a workaholic, I never leave the office, I'm not sure this is the type of people most people would want to work with. Or let me put it another way. If this candidate has no personal life, is this the type of candidate whom I want to share my office with? And inherently, or my experience, or my good part of my life, actually. I would say, I would very much argue that most people do not think this way. You see, there are people who would. There are who would, that's for sure, but I don't believe most people would, especially employees. Because you see, you go at work and basically you are supposed to have a lot of fun at work, right? Or if people for someone who has serious challenges with work-life balance, I don't think that person is too much fun. So at least this is my take. But anyhow, try to find a proper weakness here. I've done other videos about weaknesses with examples and all that stuff if you want to reference them, but try to find proper weaknesses and try to find situations where you exhibited that weakness and how you grew from that weakness, and make sure it's still a weakness. For example, if you would call introversion as a weakness, that is something that you cannot fix entirely, right? You're still an introvert by definition, but still you can improve it. So yeah, these will be the main things. And the only reason why I'm spending so much on this, because I know many people struggle with these things. So I would definitely encourage you to realize that it's actually an important point that you should focus on, and not only for the sake of answering a question, but for the sake of building an efficient strategy for the overall interview, and to have a proper tactic while answering questions. Number 4, the number 4 most asked group of questions during job interviews at Apple are about dealing with conflict, failure, and difficulties. And we already touched upon a time when you failed on a deadline. But here are some other ones. Give me an example of a time you faced a conflict while working on a team. How did you handle that? Tell me about the time when you received negative feedback from your manager. How did you respond? Tell me about the time you had a conflict at work. Tell me about the situation where you had to solve a difficult problem. Tell me about the time you recovered from a difficult situation. Tell me about the time when you failed and what you learned from it. The last time you had to apologize to someone, and tell me about the time when you missed an obvious solution to a problem. So you see, these are. I actually would go differently in answering the tell me about the time when you failed and what you learned from it, from you recover from a difficult situation, because the first one is a negative story, the second one doesn't have to. So I'd rather make it a positive one, but still there's a conflict, there's a difficulty, and there's a failure into these examples. And the reason why I group them together is because I strongly believe that these types of events in your career are easier to spot if we group these with both failures, with both when you resolve a difficult when you successfully solve a difficult problem. These could be quite related, because more often than not what happens here is once you zoom out or zoom in of a situation, the story becomes either a failure or a success. This is actually what's life all about, at least in my opinion. These group of questions are inevitably going to be get asked in any job interview. So you'd better think about situations, challenging situations, where you either delivered, either failed to deliver. As when it comes to questions such as you received negative feedback from your manager, the idea is that you want to build trust there. So in other words, you don't want to make, of course you don't want your manager to look like someone bad, because this would mean putting the blame on someone else, which would be a disqualifier for any candidate in any job interview at most high-performing companies. But furthermore, the difference between good and great examples is whether you manage to build trust with that person. So this is how you should go about receiving negative feedback from your manager. As when it comes to conflict on your team, that's an obvious pitch to your interpersonal skills. That is, how well do you communicate? On whether you're someone who considered that writing an email would be enough, which would be a terrible idea. Why? Because it's a cold communication method, and the way you resolve these things is that you call on a meeting, or talk about it face to face, take ownership of that specific situation. And these would be the main thing. The last time you had to apologize to someone, here people tend to say, hey, I have many times I apologize to someone, but they have troubles coming up with a good example on the spot, so I'd rather prepare for it. Again, all these are in the video description, so you can easily reference them if you want. So the third most asked group of questions at Apple are direct pitches to interpersonal skills. So I have, again, 8 examples here. An example, when you saw a peer struggling and decide to step in and help. How you go about answering such a question? Well, you must take ownership of the situation. You must show your coaching skills and your listening skills. So these would be in broader details. What did you do when you need to motivate a group of individuals? Again, it goes on the same lines. An example, when you had to push back to HQ or challenge the decision. yes, it's maybe not the same, but I've touched upon this previously. Describe a time when you were faced with a stressful situation and used your coping skills. Again, your ability to deliver under pressure, but more like in a team context. Think about is not just when you've done a solo project all by yourself. Think about in a team context, and this is why I put this actually in the interpersonal skills. Let's say you need something important from a coworker and the person is responding. How would you deal with this? An interesting one as well. We've all had to work with people that don't like us. How do you deal with someone that does not like you? Try to find the proper example here, because it's impossible not to have had occurrences of such situations, unless maybe you're a recent graduate where you could probably take an example from a university project or a school project. But still, it's impossible not to have these. And how you deal with such situations? Well, first you listen. So keep in mind to listen, use your listening skills. Tell me about the time when you work with a difficult team member. Again, you listen, you communicate, you ask for others people's advice, and so on. Describe a time when you found it difficult to work with someone from a different background. Again, on the same lines. And the second most asked, actually the first most asked group of questions in Apple interviews is questions unsurprisingly related with customers, customer focus. Tell me about the time when you made sure a customer was pleased with your service. We all deal with difficult customers from time to time. Tell me about the challenging client situation and how you handled it. This would be the first two. Needless to say, the customer is the center of everything we do. We always start with the customer and work backwards, to quote from another company's leadership principles. So here, of course, it's always about the customer, and if this group of questions is the most commonly asked in Apple interviews, I would assume it's a good enough reason to prepare these things in advance. And by the way, you should also keep in mind that Apple has 7 new leadership principles under Tim Cook. It's great product, simple, not complex. An ecosystem, collaboration, say no, excellence, and accept mistakes. I have another video on that one if you want to look at to get a feel of the behaviors involved in there. And I believe this could definitely help you to craft better answers for your questions. Yes, some other examples of questions. Tell me about the longest time it took you to conclude a deal with a customer. Or how do you show your customer obsession? Or tell me about the time when you went above and beyond in a customer-centric way. And finally, tell me about the last time a customer got upset with you. You see, so one note here that I don't see many people do is actually when you talk about stories with customers, to not forget to be in your company's best interest. In other words, if the customer came to you with a broken iPad, you do not just say, "Oh, I immediately replace the iPad," despite the fact it's not financially viable for the company. It's you see, you must put it in a context that makes sense. You must follow some procedures. You must eventually assess the situation, so on and so forth. So it must make sense. Everything with this customer focus must make sense in the end. Of course, you want to fix the customer's problem. And in fact, my experience with Apple products has been with Apple customer support. It's not that they are the most likable people on earth, but when compared to to Apple's competitors, they are the most efficient. So when they have to solve a problem, they fix it. Other companies might be, "Oh yes, we're very nice, we're so on, we understand and we listen to you," and so on and so on, and they never fix it. So this has been my experience with Apple products. And I'm saying again, so Apple customer support representatives have always been effective, not necessarily nice people, but effective. So they are business people. So keep in mind that when you're going into a job interview, you must show that you have that understanding of how business works, how the business that you're getting into works. And when I'm saying the business I'm not talking about the overall Apple, I'm talking about your job in particular. This is very, very, very important. And last but not least, the most commonly asked questions at Apple during any job interview is why Apple, unsurprisingly. There are many ways you could answer why Apple, and from my experience, what most people will do will to praise Apple continuously, to never stop talking about how great of a company Apple really is and about their products. And the problem with this approach is that everyone does this. So your goal in an application process is to differentiate yourself from other candidates. So what ways do you have to differentiate yourself from other candidates? Well, one of them would be to talk how can you make a difference at Apple. And as odd it might seem, because Apple is a big company and so on and so forth, they actually this question, this challenge actually makes sense in a context of answering why Apple. And furthermore, what's in for you from this experience? Again, my earlier reference, this is business. Where do you see yourself in the next 5 years here? What do you have to benefit from this experience? These are all things that you could talk about while answering why Apple, and I believe they more often than not they will appreciate these things, and of course they will always appreciate if you prepare this in advance, because it will sound so much better. So these would be some high-level advice from me, based according to some research that I've done not too long ago. And so these would be the questions that are most commonly asked. I would definitely encourage you to take a look of it and prepare them in advance. Maybe I would also want to emphasize that preparing for these questions shouldn't be the only thing you should do while preparing for the interview. But this should hopefully give you an accelerator and a way to basically achieve a lot more than it would have been otherwise possible by just simply indexing as many behavioral questions and so on and so forth. So these are the questions that I found. I'm pretty confident of these things being able to accelerate, to speed up your preparation process. As always, I hope you found this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.